So today I want to talk about something a little bit more troublesome. Um, I'm not really on TikTok ever. Very rarely I will open this app to look to see what some of my favorite musicians or artists have posted, or perhaps to check up on the girl fee, the boy fee, see what's happening on the TikTok. I also do want to apologize preemptively for my slightly disheveled appearance. I've just gotten home, but I had to film this because it's been on my mind for the past few hours. So on TikTok, an app that I do not go on very often, I was having a small scroll one time, and I saw a video that I do not believe that of a set of trends. The trend being the quote, "My trans phase was embarrassing," which is a lot. There's a lot there. And I actually saw this in a way that I'm assuming most people actually did not come across it in the way that I did, rather, is what I'm trying to say. I came across this with a video of someone playing an Adrian Lenker song in the background and them just kind of looking forlorn with that as like in quotes. As some TikToks do that to convey emotions about trends, I believe. Now, this, and there's something that is very easily avoidable as well on TikTok, but very alluring to fall into: a cesspool. On TikTok, at the top of comments, if you're not familiar, at the top of the comment section, sometimes there will be like an auto search thing that you can click and it'll search it for you. And for this one, it was "My Trans Phase Was Embarrassing," in which hundreds of videos came up. Pardon. And it was the majority of the ones that I saw were currently trans people that were expressing their discomfort or their upsetness with it, or it was detrans people who were, it's the same kind of like commentary, criticism sort of thing about this phrase, "My trans phase was embarrassing," with then photos. Mainly, I think this TikTok trend, if you're not familiar with it, I do believe this is how it started, at least. A very usually regular looking, like cishet looking girl, almost always, from what I've seen, would post. And for the record, it was almost always like a very privileged looking like person as well. Like, it was like a white cishet person that was like, "Oh, my trans phase was so embarrassing." And then it's photos of them as like a gender non-conforming, like colored hair, black hair, sort of presenting in that sort of weird 2020-ish, like non-music but aesthetic driven like subculture of like alt, whatever alt means. So just that general kind of look, if you know what I'm talking about, you can see it in your mind. And just like almost clowning on their past self without even realizing what the harm that they're actually doing by saying, "My trans phase was embarrassing." Now, I have a few things I want to say about this. I think there was kind of a phenomenon of a lot of people experimenting with gender around quarantine COVID years of 2020 to 2022-ish, where majority of us, like younger people, because I'm 16, I'm turning 17, I was online. I was doing online school. Oh my god. Unrelated. There was what I was just doing. I was ripping off the plastic bit off of my camera that I didn't even know that was there. I love it when that happens. Unrelated, so sorry. But there was this time period around when I was in middle school, and I think most of the people doing this trend are around my age. So it was either when they were in middle school or early high school or what have you, in which we were all basically online, and a lot of people came to find out about transgenderism, even though, whatever. And like transness and queerness and different subsects and micro labels, and also different ways of expressing yourself, whether it's visually or linguistically, or just however. Like, I think that time period of 2020, 2022, like that, those 2 years was, and it might have had something to do with being online. It might not have. I think it did. Okay. Partially because of the fact that a lot of queer terminology was like birthed online. Like almost every single current LGBTQ plus flag was created on like Tumblr or whatever. Like, so there is a lot of a connection between online identity and queer identity, at least currently, or a few years back. Obviously, this is not a universal experience. I'm not saying all trans people found out that they were trans because of the internet, or the internet makes you trans, as the conservative right would put it. That's not what I'm saying. It's just not. And I do not believe that is correct. Although I do think that by basically being entirely online, you have access to talk to people that you wouldn't normally probably get the chance to talk to, especially if you live in a small conservative town. And you start learning. You meet new people and you start learning about things, and you have the whole internet at your disposal, more so than you did usually during your formative years, which I do not think that that's necessarily a good thing. Although it gave a lot of people the language and a lot of I'm trying to think of the correct words. A lot of other people's experiences and, oh my god, representation of the feelings that they were feeling. I feel like for a lot of people, potentially certain feelings regarding questioning your gender or your sexuality will kind of, you didn't feel as alone in your feelings and your thoughts. Full disclosure, I am kind of speaking partially without fully, I was not a part of this group of people necessarily that found out their identity because of this era of the internet being the 2020s. I found out that I was transgender, which, by the way, transsexual alert. If you didn't know, it's not like I write about it or anything, right? It's not like I have lines about it. My most viewed video, which is crazy. But so I don't necessarily have the same experience, although it was recent. It was a little bit after I'd come out as trans that then we went into lockdown in America, or something along the lines of that. Like, within the first year of lockdown, I came out as trans, to my parents and my general family, because of that. All my friends had already known for years and years and years. Because I'm one of those transsexuals that found out that they were transsexual because of the internet, but on the school iPad in 2017. Really, something special, I know. Many such cases. But my identity, obviously everyone's identity shifts and changes over time. And that is okay, and I think that's healthy. So then when a lot of people who might not have ended up being trans got to experiment with their gender and with their sexuality and with queerness and gender nonconformity through also the internet, a lot of people who potentially weren't able to express, wanting to experiment with their gender or sexuality, they couldn't necessarily do that in real life. The internet was a very, very powerful tool for that, especially during this time period where there was a lot of, I don't know, I guess representation and activism, even though not a lot of it was real world, you know what I mean. Online, spreading awareness and Twitter threads, as much as Twitter threads are the worst thing in the world and TikTok is the worst thing in the world, they were both platforms for people to discover identities and potentially where they fit into that, or even YouTube, which was a huge thing for me when I was finding out gender and sexuality things for myself. I mainly watched YouTube. Miles McKenna, hello. ContraPoints, hello. Which I could go on a whole another video rant about how I was radicalized into the left. They radicalized me. But how I think it's cool and good. And YouTube can be a good thing for that. But then it also can have evils. However, that's not really the point of... I've gotten a bit off topic, so I apologize. But again, not scripted, probably not going to edit this. That's just how I do it on here. So... this whole perspective, going back to the whole perspective of, oh, my trans phase was so embarrassing. A lot of the people, at least that I'd ended up meeting, especially I transferred schools halfway through my 8th grade year, which was in 2021, I believe. 2021, 2022. And when I transferred schools, I met a lot of people who were trans in real life. And I was like, wow, a lot of my friends were non-binary. I met a lot of AFAB trans people. Not that that necessarily has anything to do with it. Specifically. However, and most of us presented kind of more in that alternatives. I hate saying alternative when I'm talking about subcultures, but really I don't have another word for it because it wasn't a real music-based subculture like punk or emo or goth. It was just based on the look, just on the aesthetic. My boyfriend actually wrote a brilliant essay about the rise of aesthetic and the fall of subculture. I might link it below. And there are plenty of other people who have talked about that at lengthy amounts, and I might even make a video about it in the future. But regardless, so all my friends at that point kind of looked weird, like we dressed weird, we were all transsexuals, transgenders, as Calvin Garra would put it, transtrenders, which we'll get back to transtrenders in a second, because this is the way this trend reminds me a lot of the transtrender craze of the mid-late 2010s. If any of you guys remember that, because I feel like an old person now. I feel like I'm aging at rapid rates, and I'm the only one who remembers transtrenders and Calvin Garra, which I know is not real, but it's just, going to school with people that are younger than you. You have to explain some things sometimes. Regardless, it's also having to do with being excessively online, which, But regardless, a lot of these friends of mine that I'd had at the time really didn't... I want to be very careful about how I phrase this. Most of them ended up detransitioning, even though they hadn't necessarily medically transitioned in any ways. And not to say... And that isn't to say that they were pretending to be trans or not really trans, because I firmly believe that if you identify a certain way at a certain time, that doesn't become necessarily disregarded just because you you don't feel the same way anymore. I feel like this is a huge problem with a lot of queer discourse, especially regarding labels, which I could go a whole nother video about that as well. Leave a comment if you want to hear me talk all about this fucking shit that I'm mentioning. But I believe that if your shared lived experiences are more important than the technical definitions of what a label that you use are. And I have a similar feeling to, if you have a lived experience of being trans at some point in your life, that doesn't mean that it's not for nothing, or it wasn't real at the time, or how you felt with your identity at the time wasn't real. And that doesn't mean that just because you detransitioned socially, because none of us had medically transitioned, because we were too young to, for the most part, and it just wasn't relevant, really. Or, like, that the thing is, just because you socially transition and then socially detransition does not mean that there were no ramifications of someone who did socially transition. I cannot explain to you how I had a friend who identified as non-binary and gender fluid for a really long time, and they ended up getting sent to another state to live with their other family members because they were queer, to separate them from their other queer friends. This person isn't queer anymore, I don't believe, or at least not trans. But that doesn't mean that wasn't a real experience that happened, and that just because you socially detransition doesn't necessarily mean that you did not have an experience of a trans person, at least to a degree. I think to a degree is very important. Because obviously, having a year of your life where you're using they, them pronouns or what have you, and then realizing, oh, this isn't for me, is not the same thing as, especially when you do not necessarily present trans. You look like you could pass as a cis person, just not necessarily always in the way that you want to, but like for the most part, aside from dressing like a weird person, like in the alternative subculture, however, it's a bit different than, and here's the thing, it's a little bit disheartening for me, who is probably the only person out of all those people. I'm not really friends with any of them anymore, but most of the people I was friends with in middle school identified as trans at the time, and now do not. And I am pretty much the only person from that group of people that still identifies as trans. And I'm not saying like, oh, those trans trenders, oh, it's trans trenders. However, it's a little disheartening sometimes when you really think about that, and then when you see these kinds of trends that are like, oh, my trans phase was so embarrassing. Because, surface level, there should be nothing wrong with having a trans phase. Even though, because I don't necessarily think that the word phase should be inherently negative, although the connotation that being trans can be just a phase is, on the surface level, optics-wise, very harmful for serious transsexuals. No, but you know what I'm saying. Like, it's harmful for trans people who are still living as trans people every day, especially with the way our government in the US, as well as the governments in Canada and the UK and like everywhere, is really gunning to make everything really hard for us. There have been like over 500 LGBT targeted bills this year in the US alone, and we're only on month 5. So, and most of them are either having to do with censoring of curriculums or what have you, as well as the transsexual issue. So it's disheartening then when I see I'm not saying that these are the same kinds of people. I'm not even saying that the people posting these videos of this "my trans phase was so embarrassing" trend are inherently transphobic. That's not even what I'm saying, because I don't necessarily think a lot of them realize what they're actually, at least the optics of what they're saying, and how it is coming across. I don't think most of them realize that, because I just don't know if... Unfortunately, most people are not that smart. It is tragic. Am I gonna get put on blast for that? I don't know. Critical thinking skills are going down and media literacy is going down. So, I don't know. I feel compelled to say that not everyone is terribly smart. And that's okay, but sometimes it sucks. And it's just a bit disheartening then to see people who look very similar to how both the almost like before photos, like before I detransitioned. And by the way, I need to make this very clear. I am not against detrans people at all. I think that, like, there's nothing wrong with being detrans, obviously. And it's not a very large majority of people. It's, like, a very small minority of people, and most of them still identify as trans to some degree. Or are unable to continue their transition or safely present trans, whether it's due to familial reasons or just like, I don't know, the fucking anguish that comes with being trans and now in today's day and age, etc. I don't know. Or maybe you just aren't, and that's fine. But that doesn't necessarily mean that, like, and that's not a bad thing. None of this is a bad thing, inherently. I don't think this is my, like, detrans PSA. Like, I'm not anti-detrans. I'm not one of those, you know. Because there are some trans people who are very against detransitioners. Most detrans people are also not the enemy. Really. It's true. That's a conservative myth, to make trans people have as little allies as possible. Just so you all know. But, it's very disheartening to see videos like this and see people that look very similar to both how you and your friends looked in these trans phase photos, as well as the, like, how they currently look very similar to all these other people who came in and out of my life. When they were in my life, they were weird and freaky like me, and they looked weird, and everyone thought we were fucking freaks, because we were. And I'm the only one that stayed a freak. So, it's hard to not feel a little bit of loathing there. Which is probably unfair. Because it's not anyone's fault, really. I don't really have an explanation for it. And it's not necessarily like and I do not believe that there's anything wrong with experimenting with your gender or your expression and then deciding this isn't for me, or I'm actually I don't like this. I'm not into this sort of thing. And that's fine. But it's hard not to feel a little bit of hurt when you see a trend like this that might not inherently be malicious in intention, and then you think back to your own experiences as a trans person and see that you are the only one out of that group of people that you used to be weird transgender freaks with, and you're the only one who remains. You were the only one to begin with, and you're the only one who remains after. That's not to say that I do not currently have a lot of trans friends. I'm just saying, for the sake of the trans phase argument, it's disheartening. It really is, and it sucks. It sucks to hear all this shit about, oh, my trans phase was so embarrassing, because sometimes you'll even hear it from trans people. Or rather, no, regardless. I mean, disregard that. Because it's not necessarily what I was trying to say, but the whole, like, it makes me think of, like, this 2010s, mid 2010s, late 2010s era of trans YouTube that was primarily trans medicalist content, or at least neutral on trans medicalism. You know, it was either outwardly, like, there weren't that many popular too cute. I hate saying too cute and true scum. I just don't like it. I don't know. I don't like too cute at all. Probably because it was made, both those terms were made by opposing sides that hated each other. It's also so Tumblr, like 2017, which is very funny. Maybe before that, I don't know. Ugh, my years are so jumbled in my head. But it's like, it reminds me of all these, like, back in the 2010s when you would hear YouTubers like Calvin Garra and stuff, or even like skits that ContraPoints would do with the character. Like, she'd do character work. She used to do a lot more character work than she does now, and it'd have a lot to do with sometimes it would have a lot to do with like a transmedicalist kind of narrative, like from one of the characters versus another character. Like, I think her video androgyny, or no, sorry, her video Trans Trenders, I think, has a similar kind of plot line, or like points from one of the characters. But it's almost this notion of my trans phase was so embarrassing from currently cis people mirrors the exact same kind of internalized transphobia that a lot of transmedicalist narratives would have a while ago, and I'm sure this still exists today. Like, mind you, I'm sure this still exists. It's just not a mainstream or popular set of beliefs in a leftist space. Especially now with TERFism being such a huge thing and a hated thing too. But it mirrors when a transmedicalist would say, "Oh, my non-binary phase was so embarrassing. Oh my god, I was a trans guy." Or like, it just mirrors then Calvin, like, I just hear Calvin Garra in my head fucking trashing non-binary people on TikTok in 2020, or no, before then, on Musical.ly. When was TikTok made? I don't know. In early days of TikTok or late days of Musical.ly, when he would just bash on these, like, non-binary, genderqueer, gender non-conforming, whatever, micro-labeled, or just, like, unpopular labels that go together that sometimes people don't understand, because they don't understand that lived experience is more important to language than the exact definitions of the words. But, you know, it's like, what do you mean? You can't be a trans guy and also a lesbian? And it's like, but can we think critically for a second as to why a trans masculine person, or like, oh, it's fine if you're a lesbian and you're trans mask, but the second you're a trans man, it's like, well, now you're a man, so it's different. Can we just, like, take a second and think about why a trans guy would feel comfortable identifying with lesbianism even after his transition, if he previously identified with lesbianism before? Like, it's not that complicated. Also, gender is such a mess, and also sexuality is too. Like, I don't know. That's not what this is about, though. I could make another video about that. Leave a comment below. But regardless, yeah, it sucks. It fucking sucks seeing trends like this that are like, oh my god, my trans phase was so embarrassing. And it's like, to some of us, it wasn't a phase. You know? Some of us, it'll never be a phase. Because that's just our lived experiences, and it will continue to be our lived experiences for a very long time. And especially Like, this is not great. Like, it's really disheartening to see. And especially because there's so much, and I've never personally really experienced this fully, or at least not in excess, but there's definitely, I know that there's almost an imposter syndrome with a lot of trans people. It's like, well, am I fake? I'm just faking it, though. Like, I'm not really trans, though. I'm faking it. Which is very similar to what the effects of trans medicalism on a widespread scale had on people. It was, all these young kids were like, oh my god, I need to be trans in this way. Otherwise, I'm not really a trans person. I'm not really trans unless I go on HRT and I go on, and I get surgery. But that's not like, and I need to pass, and I need to have short hair for, I'm saying all this from a trans masculine perspective, because that's the only perspective I can give any sort of perspective from. But it's just, it reminds me of all these same things when I see people talk about, oh, my trans phase was so embarrassing. It's not, to a lot of people, most people, it's not a phase. And it sucks. It fucking sucks to see this shit. Especially when it mirrors very similar experiences to your own. In which people, which maybe this is like a selfish loathing thing. I'm sure there's psychology behind this, but I don't know. I don't have any of the words for it, but this feeling of, not necessarily betrayal, but I guess in a sense of like, you were able to socially detransition. Because a lot of times, it's not fun to be trans. At least currently, to me, I do not have a lot of fun being trans. I'm not a trans medicalist. I'm not saying, like, it's a fucking mental disorder. I'm sick because I'm transgender. It's not what I'm saying. But it's hard not to feel at least a little bit of, like, when you see shit like this, because it's like, I don't have a choice. And if I did have a choice, at least currently, I don't know if I would choose to be trans. Because it's getting more unsafe every day to be transgender in America. And it's going to get more unsafe if things don't change, and because things aren't changing, they're getting worse, and they will continue to get worse, especially depending on how the election goes in November, which is something I'm terrified of. And now I'm not even like, oh, but if something goes wrong, we can move. We can't move. Canada has crazy shit too now. They're not that liberal anymore. There's not a lot of options for trans people anymore. Not that we're ever gonna go away, but no matter how hard you make it for us, you being the government, not you the viewer, no matter how hard the government makes it for us, and society makes it for us to be transgender, they're never gonna stop being transgender people. That's just not true. Like, there always have been, and there always will be. And there will always be another generation of people that are going to be transgender. But right now, if I had to choose, I don't know if I'd choose to be transgender. It's difficult. I go back and forth on this a lot. It's hard to find trans joy when the world you live in is trying to take it away from you. And as much as I would love to be like, fucking fuck the system, fuck the man, like, I'm gonna experience joy on my own terms. I'm going to experience joy regardless, in spite of all of these horrors. And I still will, and I still do, but that doesn't mean that this doesn't affect me. At least to a degree of wishing, like, fuck. Why could you get to be happy and move on, and I can't? At least to a degree, I feel that. And only sometimes. Like, obviously, it's kind of awesome being transgender. And especially being T for T, or trans for trans, for those of you who don't know, it's when two trans people date, is like the most coolest thing on earth, you know? Like, it's just so fucking awesome. So, yeah, it just is difficult sometimes. Yeah. Let me know if you want to hear me talk about other shit that I mentioned in this video. Probably more covers. I have some original songs coming soon, more of them, because I'm writing a good amount lately. But I'm also about to finish the school year within the next 2 weeks, so sorry if the videos become a little more sparse, okay? This kind of divulged into a crazy rant, but I hope it was at least a little bit cohesive and coherent. I hope you understood what I was saying. I hope this resonated with some people who have potentially seen stuff from this trend and felt similar to me about it. I don't know. Bye. I'm done.